Welcome to Inside Employment, a podcast series by Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer that explores the latest developments in Australian employment law and practice.
Hello and welcome to Inside Employment, a new podcast series from Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer that looks into the key employment issues and developments facing employers in Australia. My name is Lucy Boyd and I'm an Executive Counsel in the employment team here at Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, and today I'm joined with my co-host Tony Wood, partner in our team, and today we're very delighted to have our lovely guest Lisa Bradley, who's a workplace investigator.
Thanks, Lucy, for that introduction. By the way, this is part 2 of our series on conducting workplace investigations, and there was just something you mentioned at the very beginning that I should have mentioned earlier to the introduction to our first podcast, and that is you made reference to Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, and it's probably worthwhile saying that from the 1st of July this year, the old Herbert Smith Freehills that we've known, or for those people who have known us for many, many years, either Freehills or Freehill, Hollingdale and Page, before we merged with Herbert Smith, have just merged with Kramer Levin in the US, and we are now this kind of global juggernaut of a law firm with, importantly from us as employment practitioners, a great new additional team of employment lawyers in our New York and in our Washington DC and in our Silicon Valley offices as well. So really
exciting, and
looking forward to that.
The subject matter of today, investigations, is a global issue, and there are global trends. So it's great to be locked into that. That's
awesome. And look, Lucy, thanks for the introduction. And Lisa Bradley, welcome to our podcast. And I think it's opportune, Lisa, we have been working for at least 20 years with you and Papillon Consulting. But maybe just before we get going, tell us a little bit about your background. What were you doing before you started doing this kind of mediation and investigation work, and how has it led you to doing what you're doing now?
Thanks, Tony. Yes, my background before starting Papillon Consulting Group 25 years ago was various executive roles with a number of blue chip companies. And as I say, 25 years ago, I started Papillon Consulting Group, which is principally a workplace investigation practice, although we have a mediation practice, a wellness practice, and a working resilience practice.
So what's a wellness practice? Is that where you all have ice baths and saunas?
I wish. No, it's mostly about really having people operating at their best. So people who are already operating well, but operating at their best for work and life and the rest of the activities that they have.
That's very interesting, Lisa, because I'm sure you didn't have that wellness practice 25 years ago when you first started Papillon Consulting. I think that goes to one of the huge changes we've seen in relation to dealing with your workforce, which is a growing focus on, psychosocial hazards and wellness more broadly. But I am super interested to hear from you in those 25 years. What are some of the key changes you've seen in your investigations practice?
There have been so many changes. It's come such a long way from an approach where organisations would have a policy and a procedure, and that was implemented no matter what, and then the findings were frequently held quite close to the chest. That's changed completely these days. We still have a bit of a way to go, but today we're talking about people-centric and trauma-informed investigations, and that's absolutely critical to understand the difference that makes, how that changes the way that you approach an investigation. It also means that the key players in that investigation, so the people who are instructing or managing, need to be very clear on their roles and where they are quite limited or restricted. And also thinking about everyone who is involved in that investigation. We tend to think of trauma-informed as applying just to the complainant, and that's not the case. Workplace investigations can be just as traumatic for the respondent and others involved in the investigation.
Absolutely, especially in the case where a respondent has been stood down, and so they're not at work in their usual environment, and for an investigation you have to assume that this person may not have committed the breach of the policy or whatever, so it is important to keep that in mind.
And you know what, I don't think I've ever met a respondent to allegations who didn't think they were the victim.
Yes, yeah.
And if you have that kind of understanding and approach, you can get a little bit of where they're coming from, because they may well have misconducted themselves, but that's just what they're used to. You know, they may well have made that sexist joke or something that was said as an aside, or why would you take that personally, really? And it's understanding that approach. So how do you do that? Because I might say, you know, often investigations that we were involved in many years ago, you would take quite an aggressive approach towards a respondent, almost an interrogation, if you like, or a cross-examination. Tell me a little bit about how your style would be influenced by that and the approach that you would adopt.
That's right, Tony. That was the style that was, being used some years ago. Whereas now it's about trying to be empathetic and trying to understand the individual's perspective, where they're coming from, what it is that they need to go through this particular process, and to really try and put yourself in their position. Even the case, if you think about a respondent, they have to go home, they have to talk to their family, if they choose to, about these things, what support are they going to have, how that might impact the family. It's also a good point that you raise about people who think, well, they're in the right. And often we will have respondents say, well, yes, I did exactly what you said I did, so what? And that's because it's a learned behaviour or it's a modelled behaviour. It might be a reflection of the culture of the environment that they're in. So, yeah, it occurs.
Standards of behaviour and expectations within the workplace have also evolved over time. So I'm sure that you've perhaps observed that in your practice, maybe comments which were seen as okay or tolerated many years ago probably aren't now. So are you seeing, more generally, are you seeing an uptick of investigations in your practice at all? Or?
Absolutely, and more so for whistleblower investigations. And I think if we look back over the years, we seem to see an uptick in investigations where there's a tight economic climate, so people are concerned about their job or their peers are being made redundant, they're concerned about that. They bring about a whistleblower complaint because they're trying to keep themselves hidden and anonymous, and they can be quite fearful of retribution.
Yeah.
So definitely there's an uptick in whistleblower, no doubt about that at all.
That's an interesting observation, and I think Tony and I, when we've worked for clients who are closing down their businesses in Victoria, we certainly, once the closure date was announced, we noticed an uptick in claims and challenges to dismissals and things like that, because I guess when employers faced with losing their livelihood, they will sort of throw everything at it.
Just one of the points you mentioned earlier, Lisa, about treating people with fairly and empathy and so on. I've seen you do this, and you're much better than me. The element of empathy and creating rapport. In fact, I know this, probably amusingly, that you'll come back to me and say, the person you're investigating has offered you a job, which sounds a bit curious to me, but tell me how that happens.
Yeah, so again, it's the process, Tony, about how you bring people into this, the investigation process. And we have an intake process, so we talk to people about what they can expect, the kinds of times that will be involved, and obviously we can't predict that because we never know how long a piece of string is when we start an investigation. But to talk to them about what they need and to also give them some comfort about, as the investigation progresses, the kinds of, or the people who will be talking to them, to keep them updated, so to keep them informed to the degree that we can.
And we were talking in the first part of this podcast series about the delays and the problems that can occasion when you conduct these investigations, and whether you should conduct an investigation always, or whether there are alternative options, a mediation approach and so on. Do you often reflect on that and maybe sometimes talk to clients about, look, I don't think an investigation is an appropriate way to proceed? And tell me how that might work.
Absolutely. So some occasions where we have various comments about what's going on at work rather than allegations per se, Then we look at the relationships and perhaps, if it's suitable, recommend a mediation or a facilitated discussion to work through the issues of these people. Sometimes it can be communication issues, and so people misunderstand that or misread it. So in those sorts of circumstances, mediation might be appropriate. There are other circumstances where it might be feedback from exit interviews or a number of whistleblower complaints arriving, on the table of a board, or many comments, similar comments in employee engagement kinds of surveys, where we will look at that and really make an assessment that there's much more going on here than just what an investigation would require.
And Lucy and I were talking again in the earlier session about what we call culture reviews.
Yes.
How frequent are they part of your practice?
Yes, more frequent now than they were 5 years ago. And it really, the outcome of a culture review helps an organisation understand where they can improve or change more broadly, as well as addressing the conduct that is problematic or has been reported as problematic.
So what's involved in that? I mean, it's not just a 360, it's a lot broader than that. So how would you implement that process?
So in those sorts of circumstances, we can throw open to an employment group, asking them if they would like to come forward, but in a confidential environment. So those sorts of interviews would happen away from the workplace and possibly at times that would suit the employee, so after hours or on weekends, so that people feel that they are being well protected and are able to keep the conversation confidential.
And look, I'm going to get a bit deeper on this issue, because one of the dilemmas that I think you confront and our clients confront in those circumstances is this. You conduct a listening process and you are compiling your report not necessarily on the fact, but you're compiling your report based on the information you're receiving, which is people's perceptions of their workplace. And I've had clients say to me, look, I get it. I get that this is a review and a report, but it portrayed our organisation so negatively, because you're asking open-ended questions, you're getting responses that may well be genuine, but they're not necessarily factual. So how do you grapple with that issue? Because you're the conduit through which all these grievances are being pursued, but there's no accountability for the individuals because you're taking presumably anonymous reflections from the workforce.
Yeah.
So if you put yourself in the shoes of the client, how seriously should they take your investigation and your report?
It's a really good question, because exactly as you say, people are presenting their perceptions, and perceptions for many people at work is their reality. And as an employer, why would you not want to be understanding what's causing people concern? It just gives you an opportunity to make working so much better for people, and also to demonstrate, look, we got this information in a cultural review. It might have been out of scope, but we got this information. We want to know that we heard you. We heard you and we're going to address it. And so it's helpful all round.
I agree. Perception is as good as reality. When you want a temperature check on how your culture within your business, it's like, conducting an employee survey as well. So I think there can be some really valuable insights. I guess that if there were to be information that comes to light which was an allegation against a certain individual, that's when you'd need that more robust, rigorous process, but before there were going to be any individual consequences. But they're sort of for different purposes, aren't they, those two types of investigations?
Yes, completely different. Yeah.
So let's turn to that then, Lucy. Good segue. Lucy, you conduct a lot of quite detailed investigations into specific allegations. It might be sexual harassment. Let's say it's sexual harassment or bullying. So you've got a complainant and a respondent, and they both bring different perceptions of their reality to the situation. But your job, we're tasking you, if we're instructing you, to say prepare a report under legal privilege to us so that we can advise our client on their legal risk and exposure. And you are tasked with one job, And your one job is to say, what happened? What's the truth of this situation? Did this happen or did it not happen? And if it happened, what was the severity of that conduct? So how do you do that? How do you make a finding of fact in those circumstances? And again, sorry, I'm talking too much, but I know that when many years ago, and I'm talking 20 years ago, probably at least, we used to get investigators to do reports and they would say, well, he says this, she says this, who knows, I can't make a finding, and no conclusion. How do you overcome that difficulty?
Yeah, I can't think of a time when we haven't been able, or I haven't been able to make a finding in those sorts of circumstances. Of course, we're talking about he said, she said, and really it's the kinds of factors that you look at trying to make a finding on the balance of probabilities. And we can talk about credibility as we observe it, we can talk about consistency of evidence, and this is sometimes it adds to the timing of an investigation. If we think about trauma, for a complainant, it often takes them more than one interview to be able to recall and convey and retell their complete story. So that adds time. But I find if I'm unsure, I haven't gathered enough information, and that just simply means I need to go and do more work. Sometimes it's a case of, was there CCTV footage to back things up? Or, by fluke, was this particular meeting that was on MS Teams, was it recorded? What did others have to say about that? And we know that sometimes witness testimony can be unreliable. So it's really about bringing as much fact together as you can to enable you to make a decision, including credibility.
But sometimes you can't get that fact either, and you need to rely on the next level down in terms of your interrogation. You need to make an assessment on the witness's credibility,
yes,
their candour,
yes,
their consistency of their evidence,
yes,
maybe whether they made any contemporaneous reports or complaints to others. So you'll take into account all of those factors. And then when you do a report, that I've read many of them, they'll go through an analysis of all of those factors, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The more information that you can get your hands on, and that's really about asking the questions. There's an element of unconscious incompetence here. We don't know what it is we don't know. So there's lots of questions that need to be asked in order to uncover what might or might not be there.
And that kind of leads into one of the issues and the constant problems we have with investigations. Clients want it done straight away.
Yeah.
They want it, understandably, they want this problem fixed, they want it to go away, or they want to be able to put in some remedial steps to move forward, right? And I tend to say to clients, look, this should take 4 weeks. And then I say, okay, then I'll double it. And then, okay, it would take 8 weeks. But how often do you find, let's be honest, how often do you find investigations taking much longer than you had originally anticipated?
That's right. And of course, that all spends on the availability of the people that you're wanting to speak to. Sometimes we have people who are so distressed that they're away from work and on medical leave. That delays things. Sometimes we go about the process differently in order to move things along. So we might talk to witnesses who've been nominated first if we can't get hold of the complainant, although we have a written complaint. So we might change the process. But it takes as long as it takes in order to make sure that the process is fair and complete. And unfortunately, that sometimes means that it's longer than what we would like.
Yep.
That's right. It's really balancing the integrity of the investigation with a valid desire for things to be resolved efficiently for all of those involved. But you really can't rush these things, because then you're left with a report which maybe doesn't make a finding or isn't quite complete. And at the end of the day, that's what a finding is, what you need to rely on to take the next steps for a business.
Absolutely. And of course, if there are delays, it's you must keep everyone informed, properly informed, because we have a duty of care to the respondent as well as the complainant. And we talked about the trauma that these things can cause, so it's keeping people properly and fully informed.
So how do you do that? Because different clients will have different preferences and approaches on that. You know, sometimes there'll be a really competent senior HR or line manager involved in that process who will keep on in touch with the various witnesses or the respondent and the complainant. And maybe that should always happen anyway. But as an investigator, do you see it as your role to continue to maintain that relationship and contact? And when does your role stop?
It's a really interesting question because this is one of the processes that we've seen change over the last 3 years. So at the outset, when we're instructed, we now like to establish what the roles are for people who are going to be involved. So what are the lawyers doing? What are we doing? What's the employer doing? And this can sometimes really get people into difficulty because the employer is concerned for everybody involved, and often they want to talk to everybody involved. And so we have to determine right up front, okay, who's responsible for keeping the complainant informed from the employer's perspective? From an investigation perspective, and timing would probably be the investigator. From a health and wellbeing perspective, who's the key person to go to for that and to keep that person or the people involved informed. So that role clarification has to be established right at the outset of a process of investigation now, and to ensure that there's no overstepping. Sometimes it's just the best intentions that get people into trouble.
I think one of the things you mentioned, what's the role of everyone in that process? You know, what's the client's role? What's our role as your instructor? And what's your role in that investigation? And that will vary from client to client, and generally we will sort out some protocols with our clients about where the communication with the individual employees comes from, whether it comes from you as the investigator or whether it comes from within the business. Generally it won't come from us as the lawyers, but sometimes uniquely it might. Probably more often than not, we'll instruct you under legal privilege and your report will come to us, and then we would probably, I think this would be fair to say, Lisa, we'll often see your report in draft.
Yes.
We will often review that report and we'll give you feedback on it. And I can say, hand on heart, we'll never change your recommendations, but we might challenge you on them.
Yes.
And we might say, you made a particular finding about this. Can you just explain to us how you made that assessment based on the evidence? And sometimes, to your credit, you'll go back and say, okay, well, let me do some further information and bolster up. So our ideal is to work with you to ensure that the client's got the most credible, authoritative report, I suppose, that they can possibly get.
Yeah, that's right. And it's more the second set of eyes to look at it and say, we can see your reasoning here. What else led you to this? Or there's a gap here. Can you fill that in? Not to change your finding, but so the document, anyone can pick it up and see what sits behind your finding and that it's logical and makes sense.
That you've got that clarity and transparency. And of course, come to the end of an investigation where you're sitting and writing a report, you've got so much information in your head. And we often have to think about how is the reader seeing this rather than conveying the information to paper. How's the reader seeing this and understanding it? So,
and you're really old school in this sense. Ooh, I'll make you into trouble then. You'll actually take notes, won't you?
Absolutely.
You'll take longhand written notes of all you won't record your meetings.
Well, there's another thing that's changed. So, a couple of years ago, if we were interviewing a complainant or a respondent, whomever, they might say, well, I'm insisting on having this interview recorded.
Yes.
And we would say, well, okay, well, you record, we'll record, you pay for yours to be transcribed, we'll have ours transcribed, we'll swap files, we'll compare the files, and all of this adds to delays and the like. These days, if someone is absolutely insistent on having the session recorded, we will record. We'll have 2 recorders because Murphy's Law says that one of them will run out of batteries or something like that. So we'll have 2 recorders and we'll record. I will still take notes. And the reason for that is when I look at my notes, I've got a whole set of symbols running down the column on the left-hand side that might indicate to me the information they're giving when I'm taking the notes at that point in time is actually different to what they gave earlier. Or it might indicate to me that I need to go back and test them on information that they've given, or it's inconsistent with something else that I've heard, or more detail is required. So if we record, it's it's also supported with handwritten notes from our perspective.
That's interesting because we're seeing, more and more commentary about AI in investigations and how that's going to disrupt the process. I mean, I've seen AI summaries of recordings and things like that, but that is something, your system is something that AI couldn't replicate. So
that's right.
Keep yourself in a job.
When it comes to workplace investigations, AI is not necessarily reliable.
Right. Yeah.
And when people turn to AI for information on what should I do about a workplace investigation, we had an example of this quite recently. They got totally the wrong information and their whole complaint was off track before it even got started.
There might be a role for AI in some elements of an investigation, but fundamentally the kind of the forensic analysis that you as an investigator conduct when you're face-to-face with someone, which generally your interviews will be, is irreplaceable in one respect. We've got so much we could cover and we're really out of time. I just want to ask you this last one, and that is, have you ever had the situation where you prepare your report, you finalised your report, we might have viewed it as well as a draft, and then we'll give it to the client, and the client's unhappy with the report? How do you deal with that situation?
The report is the report, the facts are the facts, and if they're unhappy, that's unfortunate, but it can't change what's in the report.
Have you ever been pressured to change your report?
I haven't been pressured to change a report, and I think that's because people know me well enough not to engage in that kind of communication. Transparency is a big thing though, Tony, as you know, and what the client does, your clients do with the report, that's certainly changed over the years. So some years ago, those reports were, very tightly held and not shared with anybody, whereas today there's much more transparency about what the investigation has found.
Well, I mean, we mentioned in the first part of this podcast that there are a number of instances where, especially kind of these cultural review reports are becoming transparently published on websites. So, it's there for everyone, for the good and the bad to be able to review it. Lisa, thank you so much for coming. I know that you often are a participant or a presenter in one of our client training programs that we do with Marco Fedeli. So I'm sure you'll be doing that again. So if anyone's interested in more information on conducting workplace investigations, have a look at our website, our training programs that we run. And interestingly, probably not surprisingly, the Conducting Workplace Investigations is our most popular program and has been for a number of years. And in part, thank you, Lisa, for your contribution.
Pleasure.
Thanks everyone for listening to our podcast series. Hope you enjoyed it. Please give us any feedback or questions on the Inside Employment website or portal. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next podcast. And thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Lisa.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.